Uh, Great. Okay, so our speaker for tonight is Alison, and Alison will be talking about 7 JavaScript concepts to learn for tech interviews. Alison is a career changer, currently working as an apprentice software engineer at Pinterest. Prior to coding, she has 10 years of experience working in various creative industries, such as fashion magazines, photo shoots, special events for clients like Showtime and Wu-Tang Clan, brand consulting for small women-owned natural skincare brands, and an ethical Cambodian artisan-made jewelry line, and most recently, global product development for Le Labo. She also has a BA in anthropology from NYU, where she focused on world cultures and primatology. Awesome. Alison, we will hand it over to you.
Well, hello, everyone. All right, let me share my screen. All right, can everyone see this okay? All right, awesome. So hi, I am Alison. I'm really excited to be here with Women Who Code. I'm a really big fan of the organization. Women Who Code especially really helped me when I was preparing for tech interviews in my own job search. I went to a lot of like algo prep events and networking as well. So I'm really happy to be here and to try to give back. As you mentioned, I'm currently working at my first developer role at Pinterest, which has been like a dream company of mine forever. So I'm really happy to be there. I am a career changer from a very non-tech background, and I'm also a bootcamp grad. So I completely understand how scary and intimidating tech interviews can be, especially when you're first starting out. But one thing that you'll see is that certain topics and questions will get repeated a lot, especially for like entry-level developer roles. And so these concepts that we're going to talk about today are some of them. This is by no means like an exhaustive list. This is just, sort of maybe like an entry point. It might be a refresher for some of you, but for those of you just starting out with JavaScript, these concepts might be brand new. But they are all going to be very beginner friendly. So hopefully something for everyone. Okay, so first up, what is the difference between var, const, and let? This comes up in like every single interview. So first up, var, const, and let are all reserved words in JavaScript that are going to allow you to declare and name variables. So for example, let a equal hello or something like that. Before ES6, which was introduced in 2015, var was actually the only option to do that. And so const and let were introduced later on. So var is first. So var can declare a variable in any scope. So this could be global, function, or block scope. Like for example, like within an if statement, these variables are hoisted, and which I'll get into later, and initialized with an undefined value. So for this reason, you could declare a variable with no value at all. So as you see in the example here, var a, there's nothing there, but it won't throw an error. So with var, you could also reassign or redeclare the value of that variable. So if you have var a is equal to Remy, obviously this is Ratatouille themed, and then you wanted to change a to Linguini, that's totally fine. You can go ahead and change the value. And also you'll note that if you console.log b, above where it's actually written, you are going to get undefined, and you're not going to get an error, even though it hasn't actually been defined yet. Now, let is very similar to var. You can reassign or redeclare the values at any point, but with one caveat, you have to omit the word let from reassignment. So you can see here, we have let a, which is also not going to throw an error, similar to var. And if you go ahead and change a to Remy or change it to Linguini, you have to just omit the word let, and it won't throw an error. But unlike var, the variable is only going to be evaluated during execution. So we're going to get an error if the variable is referenced before it's written. So you can see here we have console.log b, and it's going to say reference error cannot access b before initialization, since it's written actually below. And you also cannot declare a global variable using let. Then we have const. So const is a bit different. const always needs to be initialized with a value. So if you try to do const A, you are going to get a syntax error. You also can never change or redeclare that value. So once you have const A equals Remy, if you try to change that to Linguini, you're going to get an error saying that it's already been declared. One way to think of this is const is like constant, like it's unchanging. You can also declare a variable in any scope, including global, which is similar to var. Number 2, what is hoisting, which is something I mentioned before. So hoisting, there are 2 different phases in JavaScript. So first you have the compilation phase of JavaScript, which is when hoisting occurs. The code is being read from the top down, and any variables and function names are sort of hoisted up to the top of their scope. And then during the execution phase, if one of those variables or functions are referenced above where it's written, you won't get a reference error saying that it can't be found. So here we have an example. We have a function called exterminator, where we have a variable cockroach A that's equal to I'm alive. So you'll notice if you have an undeclared variable inside of a function, so this doesn't have a var, const, or let, it's automatically going to be hoisted up to the top of scope during that compilation phase. And it's going to be initialized as a global variable with kind of like an imaginary var. But then we also have within that function var cockroach B that equal to I'm trapped. So if we call this exterminator function and then we console.log cockroach A, it's going to actually return I'm alive. So the reason for this is because it's the now global variable of cockroach A was initialized as undefined, is now being initialized with its new value, I'm alive. But if we try to call console.log cockroach B, it's going to say that it's not defined because it was declared with var within that exterminator function scope. So we're not able to print it outside of the confines of that function. So of course, this means, cockroach A has escaped the exterminator and he lives, which, if you're a native New Yorker like me, you're probably not so psyched about it, but good for him. So a little bit of a bonus. You probably won't get asked this, but what happens to variables with let or const? So we see that if you reference a variable like above where it's actually being declared, the variables with let and const aren't going to give you a reference error saying like not defined, like it can't find it. Instead, it's actually going to say cannot access A or B before initialization. So we know that these variables are being hoisted up somewhere, otherwise we'd be given some sort of an error that they don't exist. So we know that they're only evaluated during the time of execution, and they're not given that undefined value like it is with var. So they're being hoisted, but they're not giving me any value. So where do they go? It's this really strange thing. It's this kind of purgatory called the temporal dead zone. This is a really interesting concept. And it's actually one that not all engineers have heard of before. But I actually wrote a more in-depth article about this on Medium. I totally encourage you to check it out because it just kind of blew my mind when I read about it. But basically, the way to get around the temporal dead zone and all of these potential bugs and issues is to make sure you're always declaring your variables at the top of the scope and initializing there. It's also going to improve your readability as well. So, everyone wins. Up next, what is the difference between double equals and triple equals? So triple equals is going to compare both the value and the data type of the 2 values on either side. And the values have to be exactly the same in order to return to. So this could include capitalization, it could have empty spaces. They have to be exactly the same. Meanwhile, if we have double equals, this is only going to compare the actual value, but the data types can be coerced. So for example, if you have a string of 2 and you do double equals 2, that's actually going to evaluate as true because that data type is coerced, but that value is identical. So those values still have to match in order for it to return true. So here we have some examples. So as you can see with triple equals, it has to be exactly the same. If we do hello and hello, 2 different strings with a double equals, even though they are the same word, the data types are already the same, so there's no coercion needed, but the actual value, that lowercase and that uppercase, is not exactly matching, so it will be false. Same thing with, but if we do the double equals, as I mentioned, like 1999 with a string of 1999, that will return true. You could also do a little bit of math. If you did 3 minus 1 triple equals 2, that is going to evaluate to true because you are dealing with integers on both sides with an identical value. So even though they look differently, it'll still be true. Another one, 0 double equals empty string. So an empty string and a 0 are both considered falsy values. So even though they are totally different, totally different, they both equate to those falsy values, and that data type can be coerced. So that's actually going to come up as true. And then one catch is if you try to do triple equals with 2 different objects, it's always going to return false, even if you have totally identical looking empty objects, because objects are stored in different places in memory. So therefore, they're never actually going to be considered the same. It'll always be false. Next up, what is function binding? This is another very popular one. So function binding, when you're using regular functions, so not arrow functions, the this context, so for example, like this dot function or this dot something, belongs to the object that invoked it. So this could potentially cause a problem. So there are 2 different ways that you could go around this. You could specifically use .bind to attach an object to a function, or you could, which is the much more popular way, just to use an arrow function, which was introduced in ES6, and that will take care of the issue for you. So here we have an example. We have an object, Hamilton, which has some properties, writes like he's running out of time, and frenemy, which is Aaron Burr. And then we have a greeting function inside, which console.logs, pardon me, are you this dot frenemy, sir, interpolated in there. So if we call setTimeout with Hamilton.greeting and 1,000 milliseconds, it's going to come out to, pardon me, are you undefined, sir? And the reason for this is because setTimeout is a web API. So the this context actually becomes the window, which comes up as undefined. So as I mentioned, we can do Hamilton.greeting.bind Hamilton, and that will return, pardon me, are you Aaron Burr, sir? Or the more popular way is to just use an arrow function, and that will also do the same. Number 5, what is closure? So closure is a feature in JavaScript that is in relation to scope. So a nested function, you can picture like a nested function inside of an outer function. That nested function is going to have access to the outer function's variable and scope, but it's not the other way around. So you can kind of picture it sort of like a zip file. So the outer can't read what's in the inside. And this feature is really helpful to keep variables sort of safely where they belong and hopefully avoid bugs. Here we have an example. So this function has city, San Diego, Burgundy sign off. We have private var inside this nested Burgundy sign off function that is equal to thanks for stopping by. And we have a console log, you stay classy, city. So Burgundy sign off, since that's a nested function, can access that variable city to actually, you stay classy, San Diego. But within that function saying, if we try to console log private var, which is within that nested function, this is going to cause a reference error saying private var is not defined because that saying function is unable to read what's inside that nested function, or that variable at least. Number 6, so how does setTimeout work, or which data will console log first? I've definitely gotten this one a number of times. So this one, we have a function which first, and we have 4 different console logs. 2 of them have setTimeouts attached to them. One of them has 1,000 milliseconds and one has 0 milliseconds. So the answer to this one should be 1, 4, 3, and 2. And the reason for this is because when a function encounters setTimeout, which is a web API that I mentioned, the browser is going to put that callback function aside for later and start the timer provided in milliseconds while the function execution continues. So even though we have 0 milliseconds there, it's still going to be put aside. So we're going to have console.log 1 and then 4, since they don't have any barriers for execution. And then whichever setTimeout has the callback, which has the shortest delay, which in this case is 3. And then the last one will be pushed from the task queue to the call stack. And then that last one, which is number 2 with the 1,000 milliseconds. And lastly, number 7, what is event bubbling? They also may ask you, like, what are the 3 phases of event propagation? But usually it's in the form of what is event bubbling. But it's really helpful if you sort of know everything else that's going on under the hood. So if you picture an event, so let's say you have a very simple web page with a button on it and the user clicks that button, that would be considered an event. So there are those 3 phases. First, there's the event capturing phase, which moves down from the window to the document, HTML, body, div, and button. Then you have the event target phase, which is that actual button click right there. And then the event bubbling phase, which goes in the opposite direction back up from the button all the way up to the window. So in that first phase, you can kind of picture this sort of like a waterfall, right? It occurs when the event moves down the elements from that top window down to the target. And we rarely use event capturing when handling events. So usually when we're setting event handlers, it's for the target phase and the event bubbling phase. For some reason, need to use to attach an event handler to the capture phase, you would need to explicitly put capture true at the end, or just the true, as I have here in the example. Then that second phase, event target. So this occurs when that event target element is reached. So for example, that button. It's not handled separately like the other phases because both of that capture and bubbling phase, they will trigger that phase automatically since they finish and begin with that target element. So then lastly, we have event bubbling. So this you can kind of picture like bubbles rising up from the water, you know, goes from that target and then all the way up like to the window. So for example, if you had a button nested inside of a div, like inside of a form, the handlers would run them in order button, then div, then form. And this will continue until it gets to the top of the elements all the way up to the window. And most events will bubble up, but there are a few exceptions like focus, for example. Oops, I went too far. Okay, I don't know if I can go back. Ah, that worked. Okay, cool. Okay, so here's an example of event propagation. I put this together on CodePen, and I can link it for everyone after. But so basically, I set an alert for the event capturing phase, and then for the bubbling. So here we're capturing the HTML, body, form, div, and then that P in the middle, and then bubbling P, div, form, body, and then HTML. So I'll link that for everyone so you can check it out. Okay, so those are the 7 concepts that we're going to go over today. If you want to test them out, and also there are some other ones in here, I put together a fun Hamilton themed JavaScript fundamental quiz last year. I was in like a really big Hamilton phase at the time. I have no regrets. The music is great, but it's super fun. If you want to check it out, it's on Medium. If you want to test your skills. And yeah, and that's pretty much it. So feel free to check out my other articles on Medium. I have a lot of beginner-friendly JavaScript articles, like big O notation, data structures. I also put together an entire compilation of sort of resources that were helpful for my own job hunt and trying to break into the tech industry, especially as like a non-tech person. So hopefully that'll be helpful to some of you. And also feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, Women in Code, Slack. I'm happy to be a resource and answer any questions that I can. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. That's it.